At 10:14 p.m. on the night of January 30th, 1943, the most heavily defended city on Earth was Berlin. The capital of the Third Reich was a fortress of steel and shadow. It was ringed by thousands of 88mm flak cannons. It was patrolled by the deadliest night fighters in the Luftwaffe, machines equipped with Liechtenstein radar that could spot a fly in a coal mine. Hermann Göring, the head of the German Air Force, had famously boasted that no enemy bomb would ever fall on this city. He said that if an enemy plane ever reached Berlin, his name was Meyer. But on this freezing morning, the sirens in Berlin were not wailing because of a massive formation of heavy bombers. The radar operators were confused. They were tracking just 3 blips, small blips, fast blips. They were moving at speeds that should not have been possible for a bomber. They were screaming across the German countryside at 350 miles per hour, hugging the wave tops of the radio signals, invisible, silent, until the moment they were right on top of you. Inside the cockpit of the lead plane, the pilot was not sitting behind inches of armor plate. He was not protected by heavy machine gun turrets. He was sitting in a cockpit made of plywood. He was flying a machine held together by casein glue and brass screws. To the German radar operators, this plane was a ghost. To the British Air Ministry, it was a joke. To the crews who flew it, it was simply the Mosquito. But on that morning, the joke was about to kick down the front door of the Reich. The occasion was a massive radio broadcast. Hermann Göring was scheduled to give a speech celebrating the 10th anniversary of the Nazi Party. It was supposed to be a moment of triumph, a projection of invincible power. The microphones were set up. The crowds were waiting. The broadcast began. And exactly at 11 a.m., precisely on cue, the wooden planes arrived. They did not carpet bomb the city. They did not level a factory. They dropped their bombs right next to the broadcasting station. The explosion rocked the building. The transmission cut out. For an hour, the radio went dead. When Göring finally came back on air, he was furious. He was humiliated. He was shouting about a mosquito infestation. He could not understand it. He had the best technology in the world. He had jet engines in development. He had rockets. And he had just been slapped in the face by a plane made out of the same material as a kitchen table. Göring later ranted to his generals, asking how it was possible that the British, a nation of shopkeepers, could produce a machine made of wood that was superior to everything German steel could offer. He said, "It makes me furious when I see the Mosquito. I turn green and yellow with envy." The British, who can afford aluminum better than we can, knocked together a beautiful wooden aircraft that every piano factory over there is building, and they give it a speed which they have now increased yet again. He was right to be furious, because the plane that just ruined his party was not supposed to exist. In fact, 3 years earlier, the British government had tried to kill it. They had tried to ban it. They had looked at the blueprints and thrown them in the trash. To understand why a pilot would be crazy enough to fly a wooden plane into a war zone, you have to go back to the darkest days of 1940. The Battle of Britain was raging. The Spitfires and Hurricanes were dying in droves over the English Channel. Great Britain was standing alone against the Nazi war machine. The resources were running out. Aluminum, the holy grail of aviation, was critically scarce. Every scrap of metal was needed for fighters. The U-boats were sinking the supply ships in the Atlantic. The industry was choking. In the halls of the Air Ministry in London, the generals were obsessed with one thing: heavy bombers. They wanted flying fortresses. They wanted planes with 4 engines, 10 crew members, and enough defensive machine guns to fight off an entire fighter squadron. Their philosophy was simple: the bomber will always get through, provided it has enough armor and enough guns. They believed in the floating porcupine. Enter Geoffrey de Havilland. He was an aristocrat, an eccentric, and a genius. He was a man who looked at the heavy bombers and saw a mathematical error. He saw a death trap. His logic was brutal and simple. He argued that every gun you put on a bomber adds weight. Every gunner you add to fire that gun adds weight. The armor to protect that gunner adds weight. To carry that weight, you need bigger wings and bigger engines, which make the plane slower. And a slow plane is a dead plane. De Havilland proposed a radical idea. He called it the unarmed high-speed bomber. He said, "Let's take everything out. No guns, no turrets, no armor, no gunners. Just a pilot, a navigator, and a bomb load." The generals looked at him like he was insane. Sending a bomber over Germany without defensive guns was considered murder. It was suicide. The experts pulled out their charts. They showed him the statistics. They said a bomber needs to fight its way to the target. But de Havilland was not done. He dropped the second hammer. He said, "And we're not going to build it out of metal. We're going to build it out of wood." The silence in the room must have been deafening. Wood? In 1940? It sounded like a regression to the Stone Age. It was like showing up to a tank battle with a chariot. But de Havilland had a reason. It was not just nostalgia. It was logistics. The aluminum factories were maxed out. But the furniture factories, the piano makers, the cabinet makers, they were sitting idle. Britain had thousands of skilled carpenters who were doing nothing for the war effort. De Havilland realized that if he designed a plane made of spruce, birch, and balsa, he could build thousands of them without using a single pound of strategic aluminum. He could build an air force out of trees. He promised the ministry a plane that could carry the same bomb load as a B-17 Flying Fortress to Berlin, but fly nearly twice as fast. He promised them a ghost. The ministry hated it. They called it Freeman's Folly, mocking the one air marshal, Wilfred Freeman, who dared to support the idea. Lord Beaverbrook, the Minister of Aircraft Production, actively tried to cancel the project. He told de Havilland to stop wasting time on toys and build wings for other planes. He cut off their supply of materials. He refused to give them engines. So de Havilland went rogue. He retreated to a place called Salisbury Hall. It was not a factory. It was a moated manor house in the countryside. It was a place for tea parties, not aerospace engineering. There, in a barn disguised as a shed to hide it from German spy planes, a small team of believers went to work. They worked in secret. They worked without official permission. They were fueled by coffee, cigarettes, and the desperate knowledge that if they failed, they would be the laughingstock of the war. The construction of the prototype was a bizarre mix of high-tech engineering and medieval craftsmanship. They used a sandwich construction. 2 layers of thin birch plywood with a core of Ecuadorian balsa wood. It was light, incredibly stiff, and smooth. When you build a metal plane, you have rivets, thousands of little bumps that create drag. But the wood? The wood was sanded down until it was as smooth as glass. They glued it together with casein, a glue made from milk curds. Think about that. The fastest plane in the world was being held together by milk and prayer. Tell me where you're watching from, city and state. Let's show the algorithm that patriotism is not dead. Let's show them that from sea to shining sea, there are still people who look up at the sky and remember. Rep your city below. The result was the DH-98. When it finally rolled out of the barn in November 1940, painted in a bright yellow primer, it did not look like a war machine. It looked like a racer. It was sleek. It was aerodynamic perfection. It had 2 massive Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, the same heart that beat inside the Spitfire, bolted to a frame that weighed almost nothing. The first flight was flown by Geoffrey de Havilland's son. He took off from a small grass strip near the manor house. The observers on the ground, the skeptics from the ministry, stood with their arms crossed, expecting the wooden toy to shake itself to pieces. They expected the glue to fail. They expected the wings to snap. Instead, they watched a miracle. The plane did not just fly, it clawed at the sky. It accelerated like a rocket. The pilot pushed the throttle, and the Mosquito disappeared into the clouds before the sound of the engines even reached the ground. When they ran the speed tests against a Spitfire, the result was embarrassing. The Mosquito, a bomber carrying 2 men in ballast, simply walked away from the fighter. The Spitfire pilot had his throttle pushed through the gate, his engine screaming, and he watched the wooden bomber pull away from him like he was standing still. The Mosquito hit 400 miles per hour. In 1940, that was not just fast. It was science fiction. The skeptics in the ministry went quiet. The math had changed. De Havilland had proven that speed was the best armor. You did not need a rear gunner if nothing in the sky could catch you. You did not need heavy steel plating if you were already gone by the time the flak exploded. But building a prototype is one thing. Turning it into a weapon of war is another. The pilots were suspicious. They called it the termite's dream. They looked at the wooden skin and tapped it with their knuckles. It sounded hollow. They asked what would happen if it got hit by an incendiary bullet. Would it burn? Would it rot in the rain? Would the glue dissolve in the humidity of the Pacific? They were about to find out. Because the Mosquito was not just going to be a bomber. The RAF realized they had accidentally built the Swiss Army knife of aviation. If it was fast enough to run away from fighters, why not put guns on the nose and turn it into a fighter? If it was invisible to radar because of the wood construction, why not use it as a spy plane? The first operational squadrons were formed in secrecy. They were handed a manual that was still being written. They were told to fly missions that were considered impossible for any other aircraft. And their first test was not going to be a simple bombing run. It was going to be a statement. The Mosquito was about to enter the war. Not as a desperate last resort, but as the apex predator of the skies. The experts had laughed at the glue, and they had mocked the plywood, but the Germans were not laughing. The Germans were starting to look at their radar screens and wonder why the blips were moving so fast. They were starting to realize that the rules of the Luftwaffe, the rules that said metal is strong and wood is weak, were about to be shattered into a million splinters. The wooden wonder was ready for combat, and the first thing it was going to do was prove that you do not need steel to forge a legend. You just need a little bit of madness, a lot of speed, and the courage to fly a kitchen cabinet into the heart of the Third Reich. The birth of the Mosquito did not happen in a sterile laboratory filled with men in white coats holding clipboards. It happened in the dusty, sawdust-filled workshops of high-end furniture makers. It happened in places like High Wycombe, a town famous for making chairs, not machines of war. Imagine the scene. You have old craftsmen, men with calloused hands, who had spent their entire lives carving mahogany legs for dining tables or sanding down oak wardrobes for rich aristocrats. Suddenly, the government kicks down the door, hands them a set of blueprints marked Top Secret, and tells them to stop making cabinets and start building the fastest bomber on Earth. It was a culture shock. These men were used to working with dovetail joints and varnish. Now they were dealing with tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. But here was the genius of Geoffrey de Havilland's plan. By using wood, he bypassed the entire bottleneck of the British war industry. The metal workers were busy building Spitfires and Lancasters. The aluminum forges were running hot 24 hours a day and still falling behind. But the woodworkers, they were an untapped army. While the steel mills were screaming for resources, de Havilland was sourcing his materials from lumberyards in Canada and Ecuador. The engineering behind the Mosquito was actually more advanced than the metal planes of the day. It sounds backward, but it was revolutionary. The fuselage was not built like a traditional airplane, frame by frame. It was built like a plastic model kit. They created two massive concrete molds, one for the left side of the plane, one for the right. They would lay down the wood, birch plywood on the outside, balsa wood in the middle, and birch again on the inside, directly onto the concrete. They glued it together and clamped it down until it cured into a rock-hard shell. This was the famous sandwich construction. It was incredibly light, but stiff. If you take a sheet of aluminum and push on it, it buckles. It's flimsy. To make it strong, you have to add heavy ribs and stringers. But the Mosquito's wooden skin was its own skeleton. It was a monocoque design, a single structural shell that could take massive punishment. But the real trick was the assembly. Because the fuselage was built in two separate halves, the mechanics could walk right up to the open side and install the wiring, the hydraulic lines, and the controls while standing comfortably on the floor. In a metal bomber like the Halifax, electricians had to crawl into cramped, dark tunnels of aluminum, skinning their knuckles and cursing the darkness. In the Mosquito factories, the work was done in the light. Once the guts were installed, they simply glued the two halves together, bolted them tight, and covered the seam with a strip of fabric. It was like closing a giant Easter egg. However, the road from the furniture shop to the runway was paved with bureaucratic landmines. The villain of this part of the story was Lord Beaverbrook. He was the Minister of Aircraft Production, a man with the power to kill any project he did not like, and he hated the Mosquito. He looked at the reports and saw a distraction. He was obsessed with numbers. He wanted thousands of heavy bombers to flatten German cities. He did not want a handful of wooden toys that could not even carry a defensive gun. Beaverbrook called the project Freeman's Folly, a direct insult to Air Marshal Wilfred Freeman, the only man in the high command who believed in the plane. Beaverbrook tried to starve the project to death. He cut off their supply of materials. But the biggest fight was over the engines. The Mosquito was designed around the Rolls-Royce Merlin. The Merlin was the Mona Lisa of internal combustion engines. It was a V-12 masterpiece that powered the Spitfire and the Hurricane. But there was a shortage. The heavy bomber, the Lancaster, needed 4 Merlins for every single plane. Beaverbrook argued that giving 2 Merlins to a Mosquito was a waste. Why build a wooden plane that carries half the bomb load of a Lancaster, but uses half the engines? He argued. It's inefficient. He was missing the point. The Lancaster flew at 200 miles per hour. It had to fly at night. It got shot down in droves. The Mosquito flew at 400 miles per hour. It could fly whenever it wanted, and it came home. The team at de Havilland had to beg, borrow, and practically steal engines to keep the prototype flying. They were working under the constant threat of cancellation. Every time a test flight had a minor hiccup, the vultures in the ministry would circle, pens poised to sign the death warrant. But the plane kept saving itself. The turning point came at the official trials at Boscombe Down in 1941. This was the proving ground where the RAF tested its new toys. The test pilots were skeptical. They were used to metal. They climbed into the wooden cockpit, smelled the glue and the sawdust, and probably made a few jokes about termites. Then they fired up the engines. The acceleration snapped their heads back. The Mosquito did not climb. It levitated. But it was the handling that shocked them. A bomber is supposed to be a truck. It's supposed to be heavy on the controls, sluggish, and stable. The Mosquito flew like a fighter. You could throw it into a bank, pull high Gs, and it would not creak or groan. It felt solid. During one test, a Spitfire Mark V, the latest and greatest interceptor in the RAF arsenal, was ordered to chase the Mosquito. The Spitfire pilot pushed his throttle through the gate. He used his emergency boost. He watched his engine temperature gauge climb into the red. And he watched the Mosquito, a bomber carrying ballast, simply walk away from him. He could not get a gun solution. He could not even get close enough to read the tail number. The report that went back to the ministry was short and brutal. This aircraft is superior to anything currently in service. The speed came from the finish. A metal plane is covered in rivets, thousands of tiny mushroom heads sticking up into the airflow. At 400 miles per hour, those rivets create a turbulent layer of air that acts like a parachute, dragging the plane back. The Mosquito was smooth. The wood was sanded, doped, painted, and polished until it was slicker than a greased eel. The drag coefficient was incredibly low. It sliced through the air with barely a ripple. But even with the speed proven, the RAF did not know what to do with it. They had a bomber that was too fast for their bomber formations. If a Mosquito flew with the Lancasters, it would have to fly at half throttle, stalling out, waiting for the heavy cows to keep up. It was a racehorse trying to pull a plow. So, they gave it a different job. They decided to use it as a spy. The first operational Mosquito, a PR Mark I, photo reconnaissance, was delivered to the No. 1 Photographic Reconnaissance Unit. It was painted a special shade of PR blue, a color designed to blend in with the high-altitude sky. It was stripped of everything. No radios, no armor, no guns, just cameras and fuel. The first mission was flown in September 1941. The target was Brest, France. The mission was to photograph the German battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. The pilot was nervous. He was flying a wooden plane, alone, deep into enemy territory, in broad daylight. The standard procedure for a reconnaissance pilot in a Spitfire was to fly high, snap a picture, and dive away the moment you saw a German fighter. The Mosquito pilot crossed the French coast at 23,000 feet. The German flak batteries opened up. The black puffs of 88mm shells appeared in the sky, but the flak was bursting behind him. The German gunners were leading the target based on the speed of a normal bomber. They could not calculate the solution for a plane moving this fast. Then came the fighters. A flight of Messerschmitt Bf 109s was scrambled to intercept the intruder. The German pilots climbed hard, their engines roaring. They spotted the lone blue plane high above them. They adjusted their trim, armed their cannons, and prepared to bounce the helpless victim. The Mosquito pilot saw them. He did not dive. He did not panic. He simply pushed the throttles forward. The Merlins roared. The superchargers kicked in. The Mosquito accelerated. The German fighters stalled out, their engines gasping for air in the thin atmosphere, trying to catch the wooden ghost. They could not close the gap. The Mosquito pilot realized with a sudden, intoxicating rush of adrenaline that he was untouchable. He was not the prey. He was the roadrunner, and the Luftwaffe was the coyote. He flew 3 runs over the target. He took crystal clear photographs of the battleships. He turned for home, leaving the German fighters burning fuel in frustration. When he landed back in England, the ground crew rushed to develop the film. The photos were perfect. The plane did not have a scratch on it. The news traveled fast up the chain of command. The Freeman's Folly worked. It worked better than anyone dared to imagine. The skeptics were suddenly very quiet. Lord Beaverbrook stopped trying to cancel the engine orders. The furniture factories in High Wycombe were ordered to run double shifts. But taking pictures was just the beginning. The RAF realized that if this plane could fly to France and back without getting caught, it could do something else. It could carry a message. And that message would be delivered in the form of 4 20mm Hispano cannons and 4 .303 Browning machine guns packed into the nose. The engineers went back to the drawing board. They took the glass nose of the bomber version and replaced it with a solid battery of weapons. They did not put guns in the wings like the Spitfire or the Hurricane. When guns are in the wings, you have to set a convergence point, a specific distance where the bullets meet. If the enemy is too close or too far, you miss. But with the guns mounted in the nose of the Mosquito, there was no convergence. The bullets flew straight and true, like a laser beam. If you could see it, you could kill it. They created a fighter variant, a night fighter, a plane designed to hunt in the dark. They packed it with the latest, top-secret AI Mark IV radar. This was a heavy, bulky box of electronics that slowed down other planes. But the Mosquito carried it with ease. The wooden wonder was about to show its teeth. It was no longer just a passive observer, a high-speed tourist taking snapshots of the war. It was about to become a hunter-killer. The pilots who had mocked the plywood were now fighting to get into the cockpit. They realized that this termite dream offered them the one thing every pilot craves: the initiative. In a Mosquito, you decided when to fight. You decided when to leave. And if things got bad, you could simply outrun the trouble. But the Germans were adapting. They were moving their defenses. They were upgrading their radar. The element of surprise would not last forever. The Mosquito had proven it could fly fast. Now, it had to prove it could fight. And the first real test of its combat capability would not be a clean duel in the upper atmosphere. It would be a dirty, low-level brawl in the dark, where the speed of the plane meant that a single mistake would bury you in the ground before you even knew you were dead. The era of the night intruder was about to begin. The nose of the fighter variant, the Mosquito FB Mark VI, was a masterpiece of violence. The engineers had removed the glass greenhouse where the bombardier sat and replaced it with a solid wall of firepower. 4 20mm Hispano cannons were bolted into the belly, their barrels protruding just beneath the nose like the fangs of a viper. Above them, in the nose cone itself, sat 4 .303 Browning machine guns. When a pilot pulled the trigger, he was not spraying bullets in a wide cone like a Spitfire pilot, whose guns were spread out across the wings. In a Mosquito, the guns were clustered along the center line of the aircraft. It was a sniper rifle the size of a building. The convergence was infinite. If you could get the enemy in your sight, you did not just hit them, you sawed them in half. But putting a gun on a fast plane does not make you invincible. As the Mosquito squadrons began to deploy in 1942, the reality of war started to chip away at the legend of the Wooden Wonder. The speed was real, yes. The Mosquito could outrun almost anything, but speed is a double-edged sword. When you fly a wooden airframe at 400 miles per hour through turbulent air, strange things happen. The plywood skin begins to flex. The glue joints are subjected to forces that Geoffrey de Havilland's cabinet makers had never encountered in a dining room table. There were accidents, horrific ones. Pilots would put the plane into a steep dive, chasing a German raider, and as the speed indicator wound past 450, the wings would simply separate. The wood would delaminate. The structural integrity would fail catastrophically, turning the plane into a cloud of splinters. The crews called it coming unglued. It was a terrifying thought, that the only thing holding you in the sky was a layer of milk-based adhesive that might have been applied on a humid Friday afternoon. And then there was the flak. The wood was strong, but it reacted differently to damage than metal. If a piece of shrapnel hits an aluminum wing, it punches a hole. The metal tears, but the structure usually holds. If an explosive shell hits a wooden spar under tension, the wood can shatter. It can fracture along the grain. A hit that might leave a B-17 scarred, but flying, could turn a Mosquito's tail section into matchsticks. The German gunners on the ground were learning too. They could not track the Mosquito with their heavy 88mm guns. The traverse was too slow. So they filled the air with light flak, 20mm and 37mm autocannons. They created a curtain of steel at low altitude. The early intruder missions were brutal. Pilots who had grown arrogant, drunk on the speed of their machines, found out that 400 miles per hour is zero protection against a wall of lead if you fly straight into it. But the RAF did not pull the plane back. They adapted. They realized that the Mosquito was not just an interceptor. It was a predator that needed to hunt in the dark. The war at night was a different beast. It was a technological chess game played by blind men. The German Luftwaffe had launched the Baedeker raids, targeting British cultural cities in retaliation for the RAF bombing of Germany. They came at night, flying fast Junkers 88s and Dornier 217s. The British Spitfires were useless in the dark. They could not see the enemy until they collided with them. Enter the Mosquito Night Fighter. Inside the cockpit, the workload was split. The pilot focused on flying the machine without crashing into the ground, staring at his artificial horizon glowing dimly in the red light of the instrument panel. To his right sat the navigator/radar operator. His face was buried in a rubber hood, matey staring at a small, flickering green screen. The AI, airborne interception, radar. This was the magic eye. The radar emitted pulses from the nose, bouncing off enemy aircraft miles away. The operator would see a blip. He became the voice of God for the pilot. Contact. Range 3 miles. Turn starboard 20 degrees. Dive 500 feet. The pilot was flying blind, trusting the voice in his ear. The chase would close the distance. 3 miles. 2 miles. 1 mile. As they got closer, the pilot would start straining his eyes against the blackness, looking for the telltale glow of exhaust flames. The German planes had flame dampeners, but they were not perfect. A faint blue lick of fire was all you got. When the pilot finally got visual, the violence was unleashed. One short burst from the 4 cannons was usually enough. The Mosquito did not dogfight. It executed. The heavy 20mm shells would tear into the German bombers' fuel tanks. There was no maneuvering, no spiraling, acrobatic duel, just a stock, a burst of light, and a fireball falling into the English Channel. The German crews began to dread the Mosquito panic. They knew that if they saw a twin-engine shadow behind them, they were already dead. The Mosquito could carry the radar, the heavy guns, and enough fuel to loiter for hours, and it was still faster than the bombers it was hunting. But the RAF commanders looked at the map and realized they were playing defense. Catching German bombers over England was fine, but it was reactive. They wanted to take the fight to the enemy. They wanted to strangle the Luftwaffe in its crib. They authorized the Ranger and Intruder missions. This was a shift in doctrine. Instead of waiting for the Germans to take off, the Mosquitoes would fly to France and Germany. They would circle the Nazi airfields in the dark. They would wait. They were vultures. Imagine being a German night fighter pilot. You've just flown a harrowing 4-hour mission over London. You're tired. Your fuel light is blinking. You're approaching your home base in Holland. You see the runway lights turn on. You drop your landing gear. You're on final approach, slow, vulnerable, thinking about a hot meal in a bed. Suddenly, tracers erupt from the darkness behind you. A Mosquito has been stalking you for 20 minutes, matching your speed, hiding in your noise. You do not even have time to scream. Your plane explodes 50 feet above the runway. The Mosquito roars through the debris cloud, strafes the control tower, and vanishes back into the night before the flak crews can even wake up. It was dirty warfare. It was psychological terror. The Germans had to turn off their runway lights, causing their own planes to crash in the dark. They were terrified to take off and terrified to land. The Mosquito owned the night. The ground attack missions were even more chaotic. The pilots discovered that the 20mm cannons were devastating against steam locomotives. Trains were the arteries of the German war machine, moving tanks, fuel, and soldiers to the front. At night, the steam engines were glowing beacons of heat. A Mosquito pilot would dive from 5,000 feet, accelerating to nearly 450 miles per hour. He would line up on the train. The trick was to hit the boiler. The high explosive shells would puncture the pressurized tank. The boiler would explode with the force of a bomb, derailing the train and sending a plume of scalding steam hundreds of feet into the air. But this was dangerous work. Flying at treetop level at night meant that one moment of distraction, one wrong twitch of the wrist, and you were part of the landscape. And the exploding trains were dangerous too. Pilots would fly through the debris of the train they just destroyed. De Havilland mechanics started finding pieces of German coal and steel embedded in the wooden wings of returning aircraft. One famous incident involved a pilot named Wing Commander Black Smith. He attacked a train so low and so fast that when the boiler exploded, he flew right through the steam and the flying metal. He landed back at base with a jagged piece of the locomotive's chimney stuck in the leading edge of his wing. The wood had splintered, yes, but it had not failed. The fragile plane had taken a punch from a train and kept flying. The Germans tried to counter. They introduced the Focke-Wulf 190, a brutal radial engine butcher bird that was fast and heavily armed. They thought this would be the Mosquito killer. And in a turning fight, the 190 was deadly. But the Mosquito pilots had a golden rule: never turn. If a Mosquito pilot saw an FW-190, He did not bank. He did not loop. He just pushed the throttle. The Merlin engines, fed by the dense, low-altitude air, would scream. The wooden airframe, smooth and drag-free, would slice through the atmosphere. The German pilot would push his engine to the breaking point, watching the exhaust flames of the Mosquito get smaller and smaller until they disappeared. It was the ultimate insult. You can't not kill what you can't not catch. By 1943, the Mosquito had survived its teething problems. The glue issues were solved with new synthetic resins. The tactics were refined. The pilots had learned the limits of the wood, and now the RAF was ready to give the plane its most dangerous job yet. The Bomber Command was struggling. Their heavy Lancasters and Halifaxes were missing targets. They were dropping bombs miles off course in the dark. They needed a guide. They needed a pathfinder. They needed a plane that could fly ahead of the Armada, navigate with pinpoint precision, and drop flares right on the roof of the target factory. It was a job that required nerves of steel and a computer-like brain. But the Mosquito was not just going to drop flares. It was about to carry a weapon that defied physics. The engineers were tinkering again. They were looking at the bomb bay doors and asking a question that sounded impossible. What happens if we put a 4,000-pound bomb inside a wooden plane? The Cookie, the Blockbuster, a cylinder of high explosive the size of a car. It was a weapon designed for the massive, heavy bombers. Putting it in a Mosquito was like asking a Greyhound to carry a refrigerator. But the Mosquito had a secret. It had power to spare. The engineers modified the bomb bay, bulging the doors out to fit the massive cylinder. When they loaded the first 4,000-pounder, the tires of the Mosquito bulged. The pilot climbed in, knowing that if an engine failed on takeoff, he would leave a crater the size of a football field. He pushed the throttles. The tail came up. The wooden wonder lifted the massive weight into the air and turned toward Berlin. The nuisance raider was gone. The heavy hitter had arrived. And the German High Command was about to realize that the wooden toy was not just an annoyance anymore. It was a strategic catastrophe. The Mosquito could now fly to Berlin, drop a bomb capable of leveling a city block, and be back in England in time for a late pint at the pub, all while burning half the fuel of a Lancaster. The economics of destruction had just shifted in favor of the British, and the man in the plywood cockpit was holding the receipt. The arrival of the 4,000-pound Cookie bomb changed the DNA of the Mosquito. Until that moment, the plane had been a scalpel, a precision instrument used to slice open rail lines or assassinate specific buildings. But the Cookie was not a scalpel. It was a sledgehammer. It was a thin-walled cylinder of steel, looking remarkably like a giant, aggressive trash can, packed to the brim with Amitol high explosive. It had no aerodynamic finesse. It did not have fins to guide it. It was designed to do one thing: hit the ground and create a blast wave so powerful it would blow the roofs off buildings 3 blocks away. When the ground crews first winched this monstrosity into the belly of the wooden bomber, it looked ridiculous. The bomb bay doors had to be modified just to close around its girth. But when that plane took off and turned toward Berlin, the ridicule stopped. The mathematics of the air war had just been rewritten, and the result was terrifying for the German High Command. Consider the economics of destruction. To drop 4,000 pounds of explosives on Berlin using a B-17 Flying Fortress, the Americans had to risk 10 men, 4 engines, and a slow, heavy airframe that was a magnet for flak. If that plane was shot down, where the cost in training and materials was astronomical. To drop that same 4,000 pounds with a Mosquito, the RAF risked 2 men and 2 engines. The plane burned half the fuel. It flew twice as fast. And because it flew so high, over 30,000 feet, most of the German flak shells exploded harmlessly below it. The Mosquito had become the most efficient delivery system for high explosives in the history of warfare. It was a logistics manager's dream and a fascist dictator's nightmare. This efficiency gave birth to the Light Night Strike Force. This was not a squadron. It was a gang of hooligans. Their job was not just to destroy factories, It was to destroy sleep. They became the Berlin Express. Night after night, small flights of mosquitoes would scream over the German capital. Sometimes they dropped 4,000-pounders. Sometimes they just dropped a single bomb. It did not matter. The moment the German radar picked up the high-speed blips, the sirens wailed. Imagine living in Berlin in 1943. You've worked a 14-hour shift in a munitions factory. You're exhausted. You finally fall asleep. At 2 a.m., the sirens scream. You have to drag your children out of bed and run to the cold, damp cellar. You wait for an hour. The all-clear sounds. You go back to bed. At 4 a.m., the sirens scream again. Another flight of mosquitoes. The physical damage was bad, but the psychological damage was catastrophic. The mosquito was stealing the sanity of the German workforce. Millions of man-hours were lost in the factories, not because the factories were blown up, but because the workers were too tired to tighten the bolts on the tanks. The Light Night Strike Force could launch a nuisance raid with a handful of planes that would force the entire city of Berlin, 4 million people, into the bunkers. The return on investment was infinite. Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister, wrote in his diary about the air terror. He could not spin it. He could not tell the people that the Luftwaffe was winning when the sirens were waking them up every single night. The German people started calling them the industrial furniture. They looked up at the night sky and cursed the British carpenters. The Luftwaffe was desperate to stop them. They pulled their best pilots from the front lines. They developed specialized aircraft like the Heinkel HE-219, Uhu, the Owl. This was a dedicated night fighter, fast, heavily armed, and equipped with advanced radar. It was a mosquito hunter. And for the first time, the mosquito had a predator that could actually keep up. But catching a mosquito was still like trying to catch a greased pig in a dark room. The British pilots developed a tactic called the corkscrew. If the rear-facing radar, dubbed Monica, beeped a warning that a German fighter was on their tail, the pilot did not just turn. He went crazy. He would dive to the left, pull up hard to the right, roll over, and dive again. It was a violent, vomiting-inducing maneuver that threw the plane around the sky in a chaotic spiral. The German radar could not track it. The German pilots would lose visual contact in the gloom. By the time they reoriented, the wooden ghost was 3 miles away, accelerating toward home. But the mosquito's greatest contribution to the destruction of Germany was not the bombs it carried. It was the light it brought. The heavy bombers, the Lancasters and Halifaxes, were blunt instruments. They were flying in streams of hundreds of aircraft. In the dark, over a blacked-out continent, navigation was a nightmare. If the lead plane missed the target by 2 miles, the entire formation would drop their bombs on an empty field. The Mosquito became the Pathfinder. This was the tip of the spear. These planes were flown by the elite of the elite, the best navigators in the RAF. They were equipped with a new, top-secret system called Oboe. Oboe was genius in its simplicity. It used 2 radio stations back in England. One station sent a signal that tracked the plane's arc. If the pilot drifted left, he heard dots in his headset. If he drifted right, he heard dashes. If he was on the perfect line, he heard a solid tone. He just had to fly the hum. The second station measured the distance. When the plane reached the exact drop point, the radio signal signaled the release. It was blind bombing. The pilot did not need to see the ground, and he did not need to see the factory. He just flew the tone and pressed the button when the math told him to. The accuracy was terrifying. From 30,000 feet, an oboe-equipped Mosquito could drop a marker flare into a specific courtyard. So the strategy changed. The Mosquitoes would go in first. They would fly fast and high, guided by the radio beams. They would drop massive red and green target indicators, pyrotechnic flares that burned with a blinding intensity. Then, the heavy bombers would arrive. The Lancaster crews did not have to find the factory. They just had to bomb the red spot. The Mosquitoes lit the stage, and the heavy bombers brought the curtain down. This synergy was devastating. The Ruhr Valley, the industrial heart of Germany, was systematically dismantled. The Mosquitoes marked the Krupp steelworks, and the Lancasters turned it into gravel. The Germans tried to jam the oboe signals, but the British kept changing frequencies. It was an electronic war, fought with radio waves and vacuum tubes, and the wooden plane was the carrier. But let's not forget the resilience. The fragile wooden plane was proving to be tougher than anyone expected. There are stories that sound like tall tales until you see the photos. One Mosquito returned from a raid over the Ruhr with its entire starboard elevator shot away. A metal plane would have crashed. The Mosquito flew home. Another came back with a hole in the fuselage so big a man could jump through it, caused by a direct hit from a flak shell that failed to detonate. The wood had flexed, absorbed the shock, and held together. There was a pilot who flew his Mosquito back across the North Sea on one engine. That's a standard procedure for a twin-engine plane, right? Except his remaining engine was overheating, and he was losing altitude. He ordered his navigator to throw everything overboard. The guns, the ammo, the radio, the radar equipment. They stripped the plane to the bare wood. They skimmed the waves at 100 feet, the one good engine screaming in agony. They made it. When they landed, the mechanics found that the heat from the engine had charred the wooden engine mount. It was practically charcoal, but it had not snapped. The glue had held. By 1944, the Mosquito was doing everything. It was hunting U-boats in the Bay of Biscay, using a massive 57mm anti-tank cannon mounted in the nose to punch holes in their pressure hulls. It was intercepting V-1 flying bombs, diving at 450 miles per hour to shoot the robotic missiles out of the sky before they hit London. It was dropping spies into occupied France. But there was one mission that would cement its legacy forever. One mission that would move the Mosquito from the realm of strategic bomber to Hollywood legend. It was not about destroying a city. It was not about killing thousands. It was about saving a few dozen men who were scheduled to die. The French resistance sent a desperate message to London. In the Amiens prison in France, hundreds of resistance fighters and political prisoners were being held by the Gestapo. They were being tortured. Executions were scheduled. The local resistance did not have the firepower to storm the walls. They asked the RAF for help. They asked for a precision airstrike. Think about that request. They wanted the RAF to bomb a prison, but not kill the prisoners. They wanted to blow the walls open so the men could run, and destroy the guards' barracks, without touching the cells. It required accuracy measured in feet, not miles. A B-17 could not do it. A Lancaster could not do it. A Typhoon could not carry enough explosive power to breach the walls. There was only one machine on Earth that had the speed to get there, the stability to fly at rooftop level, and the precision to place a bomb on a specific door hinge. The call went out to the Mosquito Wing. The mission was codenamed Operation Jericho. The crews were briefed. They were shown a model of the prison. They were told the odds. Flying at 50 feet meant flying directly into the range of every German soldier with a rifle, let alone the flak towers. It was a suicide run. But when the commander asked for volunteers, nobody stepped back. They knew what the Mosquito could do. They knew they were flying the only plane in the world that could thread a needle at 300 miles per hour. This was the apex of the Mosquito's evolution. It had started as an unarmed bomber, became a fighter, then a night terror, then a pathfinder. Now, it was about to become a jailbreaker. The pilots walked out to their wooden birds, the snow crunching under their boots. They checked the delayed fuse bombs in the bays. They did not know it yet, but they were about to fly the most audacious raid of the entire war. The experts who had once laughed at the termite's dream were about to watch it perform a miracle. The weather over the English Channel on February 18, 1944, was a swirling gray soup of snow and sleet. It was the kind of weather that grounded birds, let alone airplanes. The visibility was near zero. The clouds were practically sitting on the deck. In any other circumstance, the mission would have been scrubbed before the pilots even finished their coffee. But Group Captain Percy Picard, the man leading the raid, looked at the weather report and then looked at his watch. He knew that for the 700 prisoners inside the Amiens prison, time was not just running out, it was gone. Executions were scheduled for the next morning. The firing squads were already cleaning their rifles. Picard climbed into the cockpit of his Mosquito. F for Freddy. He did not order his men to fly. He told them the stakes and asked who was coming. Every single engine on the flight line turned over. The flight to Amiens was a masterclass in suicidal airmanship. The Mosquitoes dropped down to 50 feet. They were not flying over the landscape, they were flying through it. They skimmed over the white-capped waves of the channel, their propellers kicking up salt spray that froze instantly on the windshields. When they hit the French coast, they did not pull up. They stayed in the weeds. They hurdled hedgerows. They banked around church steeples. They flew down the main streets of villages, lower than the rooftops, terrifying the German garrisons, who did not hear them until the roar of the Merlins shattered their windows. Flying at 300 miles per hour at treetop level in a snowstorm is madness. One twitch, one moment of vertigo, and you are a fireball in a French farm field. But the wooden airframes held steady. The pilots were locked in, their hands sweating on the controls, their eyes scanning for high-tension wires, the invisible killers of low-level flight. At noon, the prison appeared out of the mist. It was a grim, cruciform building surrounded by a 20-foot-high wall. It looked impenetrable. But the Mosquitoes were not there to knock it down. They were there to perform surgery with high explosives. The plan was complex. The first wave of bombers had to breach the outer walls. The second wave had to hit the guard barracks to kill the German reaction force. The third wave was the reserve, circling continuously, waiting to see if the first two failed. Picard led the first wave in. He lined up on the eastern wall. He was flying so low that he had to pull up to clear the wall itself after releasing the bombs. The bombs were fitted with 11-second delay fuses. This was crucial. If they exploded on impact, the blast would swat the Mosquito's tail out of the sky. The bombs had to skip, hit the base of the wall, sit there for 11 seconds, and then blow. The first bombs hit the snow. They slid like curling stones right into the masonry. Picard pulled up hard. 11 seconds later, the wall did not just break, it vanished. A cloud of dust and bricks erupted, leaving a gaping hole. Then came the second wave. They aimed for the main building, but not the cells. They aimed for the ends of the building, hoping to jar the doors open with the shockwave. They aimed for the German mess hall, where the guards were eating lunch. The precision was absolute. One bomb skidded through the snow and slammed through the window of the guardhouse. The explosion gutted the building, killing or wounding dozens of Gestapo officers before they could even reach for their weapons. Inside the prison, chaos reigned. The walls were open. The guards were dead or running for cover. The prisoners, realizing that the RAF had come for them, poured out of the cells. They ran through the smoke, scrambling over the rubble of the outer wall, vanishing into the snowy French countryside. Resistance fighters were waiting in the woods to pick them up. It was a jailbreak on an industrial scale. But for the RAF, the mission was not over. Group Captain Picard, the leader, the man they called the Grand Old Man of the Mosquito Force, made a fatal decision. He lingered. He wanted to make sure the prisoners were getting out. He circled the burning prison, counting the figures running through the snow. He wanted to bring a report back to London. He stayed too long. High above, a squadron of Focke-Wulf 190s, the butcherbirds of the Luftwaffe, spotted the lone Mosquito circling below. They dove. Picard saw them too late. He slammed the throttles forward, trying to use the legendary speed of the wooden wonder to escape. But the FW-190 was a diving hawk. It had the energy advantage. The German cannon shells tore into the Mosquito's tail. The wood splintered. The control cables snapped. Picard's plane rolled over and slammed into a field, just a few miles from the prison. The man who had led the most daring raid of the war was dead. But as the smoke from his crash rose into the gray sky, hundreds of French resistance fighters were running free in the forests. They would live to fight another day. They would sabotage railways, cut phone lines, and help pave the way for D-Day. The cost was high, but the Jericho raid proved that the Mosquito could do things that were theoretically impossible. It could break chains. As 1944 turned into 1945, the war entered a strange twilight phase. The Nazis were crumbling, but they were not giving up. In fact, they were introducing weapons that looked like they came from the future. The skies over Germany were no longer just the domain of propellers. The jet age had arrived. The Messerschmitt Me-262 was a shark. It had swept wings. It had 2 Junkers Jumo jet engines. It could fly at 540 miles per hour. It made the Spitfire and the Mustang look like antiques. When the Allied pilots first saw it, they were terrified. It moved so fast, it was a blur. It could slash through a bomber formation and be gone before the gunners could track it. But there was one Allied plane that did not look like it was standing still: the Mosquito. The RAF engineers had continued to tweak the Wooden Wonder. They boosted the Merlin engines. They installed nitrous oxide injection systems. When a pilot hit the giggle gas button, the engine screamed, pouring raw power into the propellers. The late war Mosquitoes were hitting 430, sometimes 440 miles per hour. They were not faster than the jet, but they were fast enough to make it a fight. There are reports of Mosquito pilots catching Me-262s in the landing pattern. The jet was vulnerable when it was slow. A Mosquito would dive out of the sun, the pilot pushing the wood to its breaking point, closing the gap on the futuristic jet. It was the ultimate clash of eras, the pinnacle of stick-and-glue craftsmanship versus the dawn of the turbine age. In one encounter, a Mosquito crew spotted a jet streaking away. They knew they could not catch it in a straight line, so they used the Mosquito's maneuverability. They cut the corner. They anticipated the jet's turn. The German pilot, arrogant in his superior technology, did not check his 6. The Mosquito pilot lined up the shot. The 4 20mm cannons barked. The jet engine, a delicate piece of high-tech machinery, ingested a high-explosive shell. It disintegrated. The Me-262 tumbled out of the sky. It was a symbolic victory. The wood had beaten the jet. It proved that technology is only as good as the tactics used to deploy it. By the final months of the war, the Mosquito was operating with total impunity. The Luftwaffe had effectively ceased to exist as a cohesive force. The fuel was gone. The pilots were dead. But the Mosquitoes kept coming. They roamed over Germany like wolves. They bombed the V-2 rocket sites. They strafed the retreating columns of German troops. They dropped 4,000-pound cookies on Berlin every single night, just to remind the Nazis that they were still there. The Light Night Strike Force was now dropping more tonnage of explosives on Berlin than the massive heavy bomber fleets of 1941, and they were doing it with losses that were, statistically, 0. In the final months, the loss rate for Mosquito operations was under 1%. It was the safest combat aircraft of the war. Think about that for a second. The plane made of plywood. The plane the experts said would fall apart. The plane without a single defensive machine gun was the one that came home. The pilots loved it. They did not just respect the machine, they adored it. It was warm in the winter because wood is a natural insulator. It did not conduct the freezing cold of the high altitude like the aluminum skin of a B-17. It was quiet. It was smooth. It was a gentleman's carriage that happened to carry enough explosives to level a city block. But the most poignant moments came right at the end. As the Allied armies pushed into Germany, they found the wreckage of the Luftwaffe. They found fields littered with broken Messerschmitts and Heinkels. And among the wreckage, they found the evidence of Göring's envy. In the final desperate days, the Germans had tried to copy the Mosquito. They built the Focke-Wulf TA-154. They called it the Mosquito. They tried to build it out of wood. They tried to use the same glue technology, but they failed. The glue ate through the wood.
The structures collapsed in midair.
The German industry, bombed into the Stone Age by the very plane they were trying to copy, could not match the craftsmanship of the British furniture makers. It was the ultimate irony. The Nazis, who obsessed over racial purity and the superiority of German engineering, were defeated by a plane built by piano tuners and cabinet makers using glue made from milk. When the final surrender was signed in May 1945, the Mosquito was still the fastest piston engine bomber in the world. It had flown over 39,000 operational sorties. It had dropped over 26,000 tons of bombs. It had shot down 600 enemy aircraft. It had saved the prisoners of Amiens. It had mapped the invasion beaches of D-Day. But unlike the Spitfire or the Mustang, the Mosquito faced a unique problem when the guns went silent. Metal planes can be parked in a desert boneyard. They can sit there for 50 years, waiting for a restoration team. Aluminum oxidizes, but it does not rot. Wood is organic. It lives and it dies. When the war ended, thousands of Mosquitoes were parked on airfields across England. Then the rains came. The moisture seeped into the plywood. The glue, the miraculous casein that had held the legend together, began to break down. The microbes moved in. The wooden wonder began to return to the earth. Within a few years, most of them were gone. They were burned on massive pyres to recover the metal from the engines and the wiring. It was a Viking funeral for the greatest warplane Britain ever produced. They did not rust away. They vanished. For decades, the Mosquito became a ghost again. You could see Spitfires at air shows. You could hear the roar of the Lancaster. But the Mosquito was silent. The few that remained in museums were too fragile to fly. The wood had become brittle. The safety certification was impossible. The legend existed only in black and white photos and the memories of the men who flew it. But the story does not end in a bonfire, because you can burn wood, but you can't not burn an idea. And the idea of the Mosquito, that speed is life, that convention is the enemy of innovation, and that a group of determined people working in a barn can outsmart a superpower, that idea was too strong to rot away. In the final chapter of this story, we have to look at the resurrection. Because somewhere in a workshop in New Zealand, 70 years after the last Mosquito was burned, a new generation of craftsmen picked up the blueprints. They did not have a war to fight. They had a point to prove. They wanted to know if the legend was real. They wanted to hear the sound of those twin Merlins screaming in harmony one more time. And what they built would remind the world why Hermann Göring turned green with envy. For 50 years, the Mosquito was a creature of mythology. It existed in grainy black and white newsreels, flickering across screens like a ghost. It existed in the stories of old men sitting in pubs, their hands shaking as they mimed the corkscrew maneuvers they used to dodge German night fighters. But in the physical world, the species was extinct. This was not an accident. It was biology. When a Spitfire retires, it sits in a boneyard. The paint fades, the tires rot, and the aluminum oxidizes. But the skeleton remains. You can pull a P-51 Mustang out of a swamp after 40 years, clean off the mud, replace the wiring, and it will fly again. Metal is patient. Wood is not. Wood is organic. It wants to return to the earth. After the war, the surviving Mosquitoes were parked in damp English hangars or left outside in the rain. The moisture seeped into the micro cracks in the varnish. It found the casing glue. The bacteria moved in. The wooden wonder did not rust. It composted. The structural integrity that allowed it to pull 9 Gs simply dissolved. The wings began to droop. The fuselages grew soft. They became death traps. By the 1960s, the Air Ministry ordered them destroyed. It was a mass extinction event. They dragged these magnificent machines, the saviors of Britain, the pathfinders of Berlin, into piles. They doused them in gasoline. They lit the match. The plywood burned hot and fast. The flames consumed the craftsmanship of thousands of furniture makers. The Merlins were salvaged for scrap, and the ashes were bulldozed into the mud. For decades, if you wanted to see a mosquito, you went to a museum. You stood behind a velvet rope and looked at a lifeless shell that was probably glued together with modern epoxy just to keep it from collapsing. You were looking at a mummy, not a warrior. The aviation world accepted a hard truth. We would never see a mosquito fly again. The technology was lost. The concrete molds used to shape the fuselage were destroyed. The skill set required to bend spruce and birch into a 400-mile-per-hour shape had died with the craftsmen of the 1940s. Or so they thought. Because while the experts were writing obituaries for the mosquito, a man in New Zealand was digging through the trash of history. His name was Glenn Powell. He was not a military commander. He was not a corporate CEO. He was a restorer, a man with sawdust in his veins, and a stubborn streak that would have made Geoffrey de Havilland proud. Powell did not just want to fix a mosquito. He wanted to resurrect the species. But he faced an impossible problem. You can't not just patch a wooden monocoque fuselage. If the wood is rotten, the whole thing is trash. To build a flyable mosquito, you needed a new fuselage. To build a new fuselage, you needed the molds. And the molds were gone. So, Powell did the only logical thing a mad genius would do. He built the molds himself. He spent years gathering the original blueprints. He reverse engineered the geometry of the fuselage. He turned his workshop in Auckland into a time machine. He sourced the specific Canadian spruce. He found the perfect birch plywood. He did not use the old casing glue. He was not a purist for failure. He used modern aerospace epoxies that were waterproof and stronger than steel. People told him he was wasting his life. They said he was building a canoe, not an airplane. They said the certification authorities would never let a wooden, home-built plane fly. Powell ignored them. He kept sanding. He kept gluing. He was practically living in the workshop, driven by the singular obsession to prove that the design was still valid. Then, the money arrived. Jerry Yagan, an American warbird collector with deep pockets and a taste for the impossible, heard about the kiwi in the shed. Yagan had a dream: to own the only flying mosquito in the world. He wrote the checks. The project shifted from a garage hobby to an industrial resurrection. They found the remains of a mosquito, serial number KA114. It was a rotting hulk that had been sitting in a farmer's field in Canada. There was almost nothing left of the original wood that was usable. But they had the identity. They had the metal fittings, the landing gear, the engine mounts, the control columns. Those bits of steel were the DNA. Powell provided the body. The restoration took 8 years. It was a forensic reconstruction of 1940s craftsmanship. When the fuselage halves were finally joined, closing up like a giant cigar, it was a moment of religious significance for the team. They were the first people in 60 years to see a brand new mosquito take shape. But the real test was the engine run. They bolted 2 Packard-built Merlin engines to the wooden wings. These were 1,600 horsepower beasts. The vibration alone is enough to shake a lesser plane apart. When they hit the starters, and those 12-cylinder engines coughed into life, spitting blue flame and smoke, the workshop did not shake. The wood absorbed the energy. It hummed. It was alive. September 27th, 2012, Ardmore Airport, New Zealand. A crowd had gathered. Veterans, historians, mechanics. The air was thick with anticipation and fear. This was not a test flight of a metal plane where a loose rivet is a minor annoyance. This was a wooden structure. If the math was wrong, if the glue failed, the plane would disintegrate. The test pilot pushed the throttles forward. The tail came up instantly, that signature mosquito buoyancy. The plane raced down the runway. And then, effortlessly, it let go of the earth. The sound was different. A Spitfire has a metallic, rasping roar. A Mustang howls. But the Mosquito? The wood dampens the high frequencies. It has a deep, throaty thrum, a bass note that you feel in your chest more than you hear with your ears. It sounded like power. It sounded like 1944. As the plane banked over the airfield, pulling G's, banking tight, the veterans in the crowd wept. They were not seeing a museum piece. They were seeing the wooden wonder exactly as it was meant to be seen, a blur of speed against the clouds. It was vindication. It proved that Geoffrey de Havilland was not just improvising. He was right. The material did not matter. The genius was in the shape. Today, there are a handful of Mosquitoes flying or under restoration, all thanks to the molds that Glenn Powell built in his shed. He saved the legend from extinction. But what is the true legacy of this machine? Why do we care about a plane made of trees? The Mosquito teaches us a lesson that is terrified of being forgotten in our modern age of titanium and microchips. It teaches us that limitations are often just a failure of imagination. In 1940, the lack of aluminum was seen as a death sentence for the British aviation industry. The experts looked at the problem and said, "We cannot build planes." De Havilland looked at the same problem and said, "We can build better planes." He turned a weakness into a superpower. He took the materials he had, wood, glue, and furniture makers, and he out-engineered the entire German war machine. He proved that sometimes the high-tech solution is the wrong solution. Sometimes you do not need armor plate. You just need to be fast enough to not get hit. Sometimes you do not need a complex defensive system. You just need to be invisible. The Mosquito was the ultimate underdog. It was the plane that should not have worked. It was laughed at, mocked, and nearly canceled. And yet, it ended the war as the master of the sky. It bombed the Gestapo. It marked the targets for D-Day. It broke the spirit of the Luftwaffe. And it did it all with a skin less than an inch thick. So the next time you look at a piece of plywood, do not just see a cheap building material. Think of the night skies over Berlin in 1943. Think of the sirens wailing and the radar operators staring at their screens in confusion, trying to track a ghost. Think of the pilot sitting in a wooden chair, doing 400 miles per hour, unarmed and unafraid, trusting his life to a layer of glue and the genius of a man who refused to listen to the word impossible. The wooden wonder has returned from the ashes, and as long as those Merlins are screaming, the laugh is still on Hermann Göring. If this story of the termite's dream blew your mind, you know what to do. Smash that like button. It helps us convince the algorithm that history is more interesting than viral dances. Check your subscription status. We're digging up forgotten machines of war every single week, and you do not want to miss the next one. And drop a comment below. Would you have the guts to fly into combat in a plane made of wood? Or do you prefer your armor plating thick and heavy? Let us know, and I'll see you in the next one.